Hey, I'm Sven Masterson, co-founder and mentor in the Mentoring Men community, and I show men how to transform stuck, painful, and broken marriages into deeply connected, passionate, and thriving relationships. And in this video, I want to talk to you about a pervasive condition afflicting many adult men, young and old alike. I'm going to talk to you about the risk factors for this condition, the symptoms, the prognosis, prevention, treatment, and further guidance on this condition. You might ask yourself, what is this condition I'm talking about? Well, it's the fear of failure. Now, I want to tell you right up front, I'm not talking about something called Kakoraphobia, which is an abnormal and persistent and irrational fear of failure. I'm not a licensed mental health professional. I'm not talking about mental health conditions. This is not medical advice. This is just my personal experience with a common fear that many men face and my experience from helping men overcome it. I want to talk to you first about the risk factors for this fear of failure. Without a doubt, the number one thing that we find sets men up for this fear of failure is a low or feeble sense of self-esteem. Now, most of these men think they have good self-esteem. However, their sense of esteem is generally anchored in what they do well. And while that has many upsides and benefits, the problem with your self-esteem and your sense of value and worth and significance being anchored in things that you do well is the moment you stop doing them well, you no longer feel like you have value and worth and worthiness for things like love. And this becomes a paralysis of sorts in a man's life when he thinks about doing things that feel fearful. And so a low or feeble sense of self-worth, a brittle sense of value and self-worth that's derived from merit and performance and perfection, and confusing being with doing are all the primary risk factors we've identified in men who are set up for having this condition of having a fear of failure. Now, some symptoms that you might notice if you suffer from a fear of failure. The first one is an attachment to outcome. This means an obsession over needing things to go a certain way and a certain amount of hesitancy to start or proceed in a direction until you're absolutely sure that you will achieve the outcome that you want. Another symptom, common symptom, is anxiety over what other people are thinking about you. If you find yourself with a lot of inner dialogue that's really about what other people are thinking, you have this issue. If not, at a very minimum, you have some anxiety issues that we need to talk about. The next symptom is indecision, or what some people might call analysis paralysis. If you find yourself endlessly ruminating over the details of something and struggling to make a decision, behind it, I'll promise you, is a fear of failure. The next thing, and this might seem out of place to some people, are little white lies. Now, men tell little white lies when they're afraid of the consequences of being truthful. And men are afraid of the consequences of being truthful when they're fearful of failure. Another symptom that's common is complacency. You see, men get complacent when they're afraid to live with boldness and courage and the determination needed to do hard and difficult things. Another common set of symptoms for men that fear failure is seeking comfort and certainty. Now, the seeking of certainty is very much the same thing that we talked about a moment ago when we talked about attachment to outcome and indecision and analysis paralysis. But seeking comfort is also kind of an antidote that men seek out when they're afraid to push into something that seems challenging. Instead, they direct their attention to being comfortable, to feeling safe, to feeling without risk. Now, what else? Playing small. Now, what do we mean by playing small? I've never really liked this term sometimes because it's been kind of ambiguous. Playing small means playing the game of life with teammates, you might say, or in a context that is well below what you're capable of. You might think of it this way. Imagine that you go all the way through high school and college, and you're in a master's program, and it starts to get difficult. And so you rewind all the way back to the 9th grade, and you go into your 9th grade classes, and you're the first person to raise their hand, and you just dominate those ninth graders with your advanced knowledge and insights into the material. Well, that would feel kind of cool in some ways, but at the end of the day, you accomplish that by playing small, by setting yourself in a context where it's easy to win. There's no risk, and you dominate everyone else. And men tend to do this when they're afraid of failure. Lastly, men that are afraid of failure tend to have a high degree of judgment and critique for the efforts and actions and attitudes of other men. Now, you might say, that's kind of interesting. Well, let me tell you why this is. Because when a man is actually avoiding the challenge that comes with being a man, being a person on planet Earth, being invited constantly to do bold and courageous things, when we don't do that, we carry around a certain sense of shame and judgment of ourselves. And rather than just be honest with ourselves about our own kind of disappointment and contempt for our lack of courage, we tend to project this on others, usually the people around us, the people we're closest to. Now let's talk about the long-term prognosis of people with a fear of failure. If left untreated, the fear of failure primarily leads to regret. That is getting to life, at the end of life, sitting on your deathbed and saying, I wish I had, instead of I'm glad I did. And that's no way to live for any human. The next one is self-doubt. You might experience, if you leave this untreated, tremendous sense of shame, apprehension, ongoing apprehension, powerlessness, repulsiveness to yourself and to others, and dependency. However, if you treat your fear of failure, you instead can replace regret with satisfaction, self-doubt with self-confidence, shame with self-respect, apprehension with enthusiasm, powerlessness with courage, repulsiveness with attractiveness, and dependency with freedom. Now let's talk about some preventative steps for avoiding the fear of failure. The very first and most important thing is to surround yourself in connection with men who are living courageous lives. If you want to have victory, overcoming a fear of failure, you need to be with people who are regularly doing that. If you want to surround yourself with other men who are also afraid to fail, you're going to have a hard time escaping that inertia. It's that whole crab in the pot thing. As you try, you're going to find the people around you, the men around you are going to be intimidated by you overcoming such a fear, and it's going to be something that you're going to struggle with. And so you must surround yourself in deep connection with courageous men. The second thing you must do is you must learn to radically accept yourself. That means overcoming the judgment you have towards yourself, the harshness. Now you might say, well, how is that possible? Don't I need a little bit of like beating my own ass in order to overcome the friction of doing hard things? I would suggest no. You see, when I am judging myself and I am shaming myself, I fundamentally do not accept who I am. And I don't accept my context, where I am at this moment. And so when I'm afraid, it's very important not to just ignore that or pretend I'm not afraid. I must first accept that that's what I am. I'm afraid. Nobody moves past a fear of failure by just losing fear. That's not how it works. Instead, it's by acknowledging and accepting that we have fear and finding this other thing we call courage, which is the willingness to do something even though it's fearful. And we cannot do that if we will not accept who we are and what our experience is in this moment. The next thing we must do from that place of courage is hold on to a courageous optimism. Now, this gets really tricky, and once again, this is really benefited by being in the company of courageous men. Because, brother, when we're doing things that are hard, when we're pushing into areas that scare us, it does get fearful. It's hard to hang on to courage, and it takes an optimism that, quite honestly, is very hard to do on your own. And so we must cultivate a courageous optimism, the belief that who we are in the future will be enough to lead us through whatever circumstances we are going to encounter. The next thing we need is non-negotiable authenticity. Because if you are going to be a courageous person, if you're going to push into fear, as I've already mentioned, you need to be able to admit when you're not. You need to be able to admit to brothers, people who love you that you have a struggle, but that you're pushing through it. And you need to be committed to being real and authentic, because the moment you lose that commitment, you'll start to hide. And when you start to hide, that is to give into fear. That is to move into falsehood, to move into a veil, and to live behind an imposter facade. And that doesn't benefit you. It will not actually equip you to move forward into hard things that are fearful. And so you must commit yourself to a non-negotiable level of authenticity. The next thing you must need is a thirst for maturity. Now, I'm not in any way suggesting that to be fearful is immature, but to avoid fearful things is to head in a direction of immaturity, because life puts fearful things in our way. And if we keep seeking comfort, if we keep going back to what is easy, going towards having other people do things for us, we're going to stay immature as men. It's a lot like if we just plopped you down on a 2 or 3 square foot island in this great big world and said, okay, go explore. But in your fear, you don't want to do that. And so as a human, you don't really get to mature off that little 3-foot square island. And so what helps us to mature is to push into the discomfort of growing, the discomfort of maturity. And we must thirst for that. We must want that more than the comfort of not maturing. Lastly, all of this I could wrap up into an umbrella as having a devotion and commitment to yourself. You must be devoted and committed to your own journey as a human. Now let's talk about treatment. The first thing in the step of treating a fear of failure is to fortify those feeble sources of value and self-worth that I talked about a moment ago. Next is to uncover and address the root causes of those feeble sources of value and self-worth. In our community, we have identified and routinely see that those are shame, fear, anxiety, and insecurity. You must replace dependency with personal agency and ownership and self-reliance. Now, I'm not talking about the misconception of self-reliance, which is that you go off and you live a lone wolf life where you're disconnected with other people and you fill up a bunker with Band-Aids and beans. That's not self-reliance. I'm talking about a self-reliance that looks towards yourself to satisfy some basic needs that you might be tempted to look towards another person because of being fearful. Lastly, we must learn to reframe failure and create meaning instead of being victimized by circumstances. Now, one of my favorite things to talk about is reframing meaning. Now, what do I mean by that? We have to reframe failure. So reframing failure means to start thinking differently about failure. And that means moving from seeing failure as a negative outcome that happens to me and seeing it instead as a learning experience that happens for me. To reframe failure also means to stop thinking in terms like success or failure or failing, and instead think in terms like success or learning. You see what I did there? I reframed failure to learning, because it's a lot easier to overcome the fear of failure when I am thinking about it instead as the fear of learning. If I said, hey, friend, are you afraid of learning? You'd probably say, Sven, no, that's stupid. Why would you ask me that? Well, if I said, are you afraid of failing? You might say, yeah, I kind of am. Well, the only difference is our perspective about what those experiences mean. And so to overcome the fear of failure, a very useful tool in that toolbox is to reframe failure so we start understanding it as learning instead of failure. Now, a great example of how to start seeing this is to be inspired by the stories of other men. One of my favorite examples of somebody who just pushed and pushed and pushed into what might have been perceived as failure is this guy. Now, I'm going to tell you about some failures and then we'll talk about who this is. In 1832, this man failed in business. He went bankrupt. In 1832, he was also defeated in the legislature. And 2 years later, he failed in business again with bankruptcy. 3 years later, his fiancee died. 1 year later, had a nervous breakdown. 3 years later, he was defeated in an election. A few years later, 1843, defeated for the U.S. Congress. 5 years later, defeated again for the U.S. Congress. 7 years later, defeated for the U.S. Senate. 1 year later, defeated for the Vice President. 2 years later, defeated for the U.S. Senate. And 2 years later, elected President of the United States of America. That is the story of Abraham Lincoln. And though we revere this man in American society, we're thankful to him for his contributions to our country and our history. Many of us don't know just the storied past that Lincoln had in his journey to the White House. Now, let's talk about some guidance. It's not unmanly or weak to seek guidance. In fact, it's fair to say it might even be cowardly not to. Guidance is also not just for the very young. A lot of men are quite surprised to hear that we talk to men well into their 70s. Now that feels a little bit weird sometimes, being younger than a man that we're giving guidance to, but it really makes sense. You're never really too old for learning. And so guidance is for anyone. Next, most experiences worth pursuing are enhanced with a guide. If you told your friends, hey, I'm thinking about summiting Everest or taking a journey to the South Pole, and they said, are you going to take a guide? If you said no, most of your friends would think you're silly. They would think you're immature, they would think you're ill-prepared, and to be honest, that you're quite foolish. And yet when it comes to getting help for some of the basic things that we experience as men, we can often have a stigma associated with the concept of getting help. But climbing Everest pales in comparison to what it means to live an epic life as a man. And so I would just encourage you to give that some thought. Lastly, women are attracted to men who take good care of themselves inside and out. And women tell us all the time they're thrilled to know that men like us are helping other men and that they wish the men in their lives would do this kind of thing. So what can you do if you are thinking, hey, maybe I need a guide to help me through my fear of failure? The very first thing you can do is look below in the description. You'll see a link where you can schedule a free session with myself or one of the other mentors in the Mentoring Men community, where we'll talk about what it is that you're afraid of. We'll help you begin to understand your fear of failure. We'll help you with that treatment plan. We'll show you the basic steps for getting through this fear, how to find courage, how to avoid or flee from dependency, how to start addressing your shame and fear and anxiety and insecurity. We'll help you with all of that right there in that first complimentary call. You can find that link below in the description. Also, below in the description, you'll find another link where you can just join our private men's-only community. That's a really low-risk way to check us out. You can come and explore content that we provide that we do not put on YouTube for members only. You can learn about who we are. You can learn a little bit more about our ethos, our core virtues, what we're about, what makes us tick, and how we help men. You'll also find that link in the description below. Next, you can just send me an email with a question about this video or any other. You can find my email address here on the screen, sven@mentoring.men. Lastly, if you got something out of this video, I would love it if you'd hit the thumbs up, subscribe, ding the bell, all that stuff. It would mean even more to me if you leave a comment or question below. That helps us have engagement on our channel. It helps us know what kind of content to make to serve you, and it helps the YouTube algorithm put our stuff in front of other men. And with that, I wish you a good day. Take care.